Hello and welcome to Interpreting India. Geopolitical realignments, sustainable growth, healthcare financing, inclusive digital transformations, climate change, supply chain disruptions, urbanization, and several other critical global matters envelop the world as India holds the G20 presidency. We at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and across the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. Today, we are discussing one of the most enduringly important subjects of modern India, the Indian city. One of the most visible signs of India's economic development in the past 75 years has been the growth of its cities. Some of them are now amongst the largest on the planet, both in terms of area and population. More interestingly, our last census shows a faster growth rate of small townships and urban areas as well. As the world's most populous country grows and urbanizes, the quality of life in its cities will start to determine how well India can grow and what quality of life it in turn provides to its citizens. Indian cities are far from perfect. They're often not well planned. They're coping with problems of rapid growth, inefficient use of land, and the supply of other resources. And Indian cities often suffer from a lack of basic amenities and safety related problems. In this context, the spread of COVID 19 led to a renewed debate on the nature and design of our cities, and some even argued for a fundamental rethink of how our cities should be designed and governed. Many of these issues are discussed at length in the excellent new book, India's Blind Spot: Understanding and Managing Our Cities. And the book's author, Devashish Dhar, is our guest at Interpreting India today. Devashish is a former public policy specialist at Niti Aayog. He is a Mason Fellow from the Harvard Kennedy School and Lee Ka-shing Scholar from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. Devashish, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you so much, Anirudh, and thank you so much for creating such a brilliant podcast, which is a sort of go-to podcast for us policy enthusiasts.
Thanks, Devashish. So let's start. I wanted to start by asking you about what prompted you to think about cities in this current context and what prompted your investigation.
Right. So, two things. One, just like other Indians who are invested in India's growth story, or at least curious about which way are we heading. So, I, just like others, 1.5 billion others, I was interested in how cities are doing and where we're heading and so on, and their role in the larger economic growth. So, one is that part. The second is because of my vocation. In the sense, I'm a policy professional and I joined Niti Aayog to write national policy documents. I was late for a meeting essentially, and for the sectors on which I had already worked were picked by my colleagues who have also worked on those sectors, and they had even better expertise actually, so to speak. But I got few sectors, and the vice chairman of Niti Aayog asked me like, "These are the sectors left out, and why don't you pick few of them?" And I quickly glanced through. I had 30 seconds to pick few sectors out of the 15 sectors that were offered to me. And I quickly thought which are the ones which will be the binding constraint to India's growth story in 21st century. And I quickly thought of, I saw urbanization, I saw water resources, I saw energy, I saw sustainability, and those are the sectors I actually picked to work on. But for other sectors, I could find a sort of a baseline book, that would give you the entire sort of gamut of issues and evidence and probable sort of policy pathways that I can explore on, to build on my work. But for urbanization, I did not find any such book, honestly. But 3 years after that realization, I thought, why shouldn't I write this book? And purely because of the virtue of the fact that I was in Niti Aayog and I met India's, craziest innovators to richest business folks to farmer representatives and labor representatives and so on. So it was quite an interesting journey for me to sort of receive the thoughts, from all around. And I anchored various stakeholder consultations, again, which is a great place to sort of receive ideas from other folks. So then I thought, well, if I have the ideas, I have the curiosity, I have the interest, and so far, so-called training for such an exercise, I thought I'll give it a shot and see how well it is received by the larger population.
That's great, and I'm glad you wrote something that's accessible to the wider public. I want to pick off on something you said. You used the phrase binding constraint. So why do you think urbanization is a binding constraint for India's long-term development?
Right. So binding constraints of what? I mean, binding constraints, just to think like an economist, it is something that if the bottlenecks are removed, it would unleash the next frontier of growth. You would move towards the new productivity frontier, so to speak. But if you do not sort of address those binding constraints, it is likely possible that the productivity frontier would sort of fall down, and the pace and acceleration of growth would sort of decline, or would not maintain pace. So, well, that is what I thought is binding constraints. And urbanization, I think so, because it's essentially a contest between two forces. One is agglomeration forces, the other is congestion forces, essentially. And you are just trying to see how that will play out in cities and how that will sort of contribute to state growth and economic, national economic growth and so on. And that's why it is. I mean, and we are seeing a bunch of those forces sort of playing out. Like agglomeration forces is one sort of definition of forces, but you see different sort of ways in which agglomeration forces play out, right? And similarly for congestion, congestion forces is just not traffic alone, but how much you pay for potable water or private solutions to public problems or for private security and so on and so forth, right? And just to see that, the success of cities historically has sort of been anchored in the contest between these two forces. I figured that, in case of India also, we are looking at so many of these problems right now. And it is nothing new. I mean, all major civilizations and countries have faced similar sort of issues. And countries and civilizations which have been able to overcome that, they have continued to sort of, march forward on their growth and prosperity journey. And that's what I thought, that, urbanization, there are just way too many issues for us to ignore or to even think that, time will resolve for certain things. I mean, in my book, I've taken the liberty to even recommend that, there are few problems which will get solved with time and with growing per capita income. But urbanization as a whole cannot be looked at like that. There are some key fundamental problems all across us, and that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, our productivity frontier is definitely not going to go up. It's probably going to decline.
Yeah, and I mean, your explanation is like perfectly sensible and logical. But while you were saying, I was thinking of something else, which is that historically, cities also, they decay and they grow, and there are dynamic cities and there are cities that are kind of past their peak. And as cities start to decay, people move to new cities and new cities become dynamic, right? So in that sense, why is the binding constraint on urbanization a problem, right? So I mean, for example, if Delhi does not remain dynamic, would the populace move to Noida or Greater Noida or Gurgaon, right?
Right. So so the book doesn't aims to sort of resuscitate, revive, or maintain the status quo on a few particular cities. It is largely to look at the phenomena which is urbanization and which goes beyond the success of a few cities, right? I mean, even Constantinople sort of declined for a bit there. So did Baghdad, and so did the Harappan cities of Dholavira and so on, and even the Magadha Empire cities. Vijayanagar sort of crumbled, right? In South, and then you can look at Italian city states, and there's a bunch in Europe as well that you can talk of, right? So it's not, the book is not the study of a few cities and how to sort of maintain the status quo or revive them. It is about the larger phenomena of political economy, phenomena of urbanization and what comes with it and what forces does it unleash, and to sort of unpack that phenomena to largely understand that while economic growth is very fickle, and so is labor movement, and so is wages, right? And it would move according to the laws of economics, and it's very fickle. It doesn't stick to one geography or one investor or one country if they do not do well. So in that case, I mean, if it moves to Greater Noida, it's fine. But at some point, Greater Noida will face those issues that Delhi is facing now, right? And the issues that Greater Noida is facing is very different from the issues but Delhi is facing. But the problem of sort of maintaining the economic growth remains same. So, for instance, in Delhi, the forces of, say, traffic and unaffordable rents and unaffordable property prices, some problem with infrastructure is there. Of course, it's better than a lot more cities, but it is certainly there. Then the problem of flooding is there, and so on and so forth. I can go on and on about it, right? But similarly, there are problems with Greater Noida, which is about how close it is to the labor market, to the job market, or is it actually providing agglomeration forces, or can you really do innovation in Greater Noida, or is safety really an issue? Because I hear a lot of episodes about interpersonal violence in Greater Noida, right? So these are forces, they're different congestion forces, but they're all playing out in different cities, and we need to manage that. So it's not about a few cities, it's about maintaining, sort of leveraging urbanization, which comes to every civilization and country at a certain kind of time. It is very important to leverage that, because no country or civilization has grown without fair bit of industrialization and urbanization put together. I think those are actually two legs on which long-term economic growth sort of sustains, because these two forces, industrialization and urbanization, within themselves pack pretty much everything that is to be known about economic policy or socio-economic and political economy transformation, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the stakes are higher when you live in a much more globalized economy, because capital mobility and labor mobility means that it might not shift to Greater Noida, it might shift to another country entirely. And then you lose out on that opportunity on a permanent basis. It's not that you can try a new experiment in a new Indian city and start from scratch. You've basically lost that opportunity for good.
For instance, like industrialization and urbanization, they're a means to the end of economic growth, and similarly, economic growth is also an end to sort of socio-economic slash political economy transformation as well, right? Where you're looking much more at social justice, inclusivity, sustainability, and so on and so forth, right? The other, not the other, but the real sort of noble pursuits, and economic growth sort of feeds into that, right? So if you miss the bus on urbanization, right, and if it goes elsewhere, so the forces that it would have unleashed otherwise, you would have also missed that. The transformation that might have come with it, you would have missed that, and that's a problem that would be very difficult to eradicate.
Yeah, and this takes us back to one of the themes that you start off, or that you put in the initial portion of your book, which is about some ideas or themes that are very specific to India's urbanization, and things that people, not just in India, but around the world, should be paying attention to. So, can you talk us through some of those?
Yeah. So essentially, if you look at to write this book, I had to study a lot of history to see what really changes in a city when cities decline and why they go up, and of course they were intertwined with the economic process and industrialization and so on. And but you also see that they unleash different kind of forces, as I said about political economy slash socioeconomic, and for different countries it has been very different, right? For Europe it was different, for Americas it was different, especially North America. Then for East Asia, it was different. For China, it has been different. And in case of India, we are seeing those forces sort of playing out. And I've highlighted those 7 forces, and it's devoid of chest thumping. It is something that has to happen if Indian cities continue to grow and we continue to leverage urbanization. I mean, it's devoid of jingoism. So one is that that Indian cities will be at the center of global value chain, which is fairly logical. But I sort of unpack that why it would be the case that all the global CEOs and global companies and key market investors will sort of look at the Indian consumer, not even coming from tier 1 city, but say a tier 3, tier 4 city, and think about how I'm going to leverage that person, right? Because India continues to grow, the purchasing power is growing, and it's a huge market, right? So everyone is trying to tap into that. So one is that. The other is about international labor movement, because labor movement doesn't really happen from rural areas to international cities. It's largely happened from the cities, Indian cities, to global cities, right? And India is perhaps the only country which provides such a vast pool of workforce which speaks English and is trained in STEM, and has largely been a very constructive and very positive and net contributor sort of diaspora, as compared to a lot of other countries which have been either shy or inward looking or have had certain legacy problems, right? So in that regard, India has been doing well on that part. The third I would pick up is the emancipation from the whole caste and gender issues, because these are the two structures which are largely rural, set in the rural construct. And in cities, essentially what matters is what you can do, how well you can do, and at what wage can you do, essentially. And that settles the conversation. And that's why the economic identity sort of precedes the other identities. It's not to say that you have to shun the other identities. You can embrace as and when you go, but you will not be identified in distress that, oh, you are this person from this community, or, oh, you're a woman, and that's why you'll be disadvantaged, essentially. So what matters is how good of a work resource I am to companies and to the city, and what wage can I get for that, right? And similarly, there's something I've mentioned about how innovation, like the number of unicorns India is creating, and the IPRs and the patents that we're filing is crazy, right? And that talks about innovation and how sort of when you reach a certain sort of a size of economy at the city level, how the innovation sort of gets spurred, and then it's a force that you do not have to do much. You have to just ensure that there are no major congestion forces, and it will continue to sort of grow. Similarly, I've talked about the sustainability. It is very counterintuitive because 80% of the emission comes from cities, but it is only in the cities we'll find solutions to these problems, right? Just like hydrogen fuel or EV vehicles and the energy saving companies, the whole concept of energy efficiency and resource efficiency is something that has been championed in cities, and it is cities that can sort of continue to innovate and find much more resource efficient way to sort of go about environment sustainability and sort of controlling the emissions. And I think the last part was about the whole the contest between liberalism and conservatism, essentially, which is like how the US cities, coastal cities, vote very different from the Midwest. And it's, it tells you a lot about the political structure. And that's why I sort of unpack what's happening in Indian cities and when it comes to social and economic liberalism and social and economic conservatism, and what the voters are sort of prioritizing right now, and, what will be the hierarchy in the coming decades as cities continue to grow.
Yeah, and just to clarify, these are not all problems that people need to solve. These are all features that are in some ways unique to Indian cities and that we need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, these are not problems. These are the major trends. I mean, I can think of 20 others, but I could see them sort of being subsumed in one of the other sections, right? Like, for instance, there's also a section on the SDGs. Like the SDG, the deadline is 2030, right? But how the Indian cities deliver on SDGs will define the fate of SDGs. And I'm not even overstating. It's purely because of the tyranny of numbers that we have on our side, right? The demographic dividend or a disaster, however you want to sort of put it. But these are features. These are not problems, but these are features. These are transformations. These are global political economic trends which are unfolding. And this chapter, the second chapter, is largely written for the global audience. That, well, the China talk is great. I'm sure. I mean, we have this lot to learn. But as predicted, they have sort of run into a wall, and it seems difficult that they'll be able to climb over that wall in terms of economic growth and solve for the host issues that China is facing. But the next frontier market, then large market, becomes India. And what's happening here is important for people globally, because whether we like it or not, what is happening in India will be felt on the other side of the world. And it's the case, as we are seeing, unfortunately, with Canada. But it's going to happen. It's happened in Singapore. It happens in East Asia. It's happening in European cities. It's happening in Americas. The UNGA is ongoing, right? And all those, what's happening in these cities is actually playing out. And I mean, G20 was a classic example of what happened, and how they were sort of setting up and taking notice of the trends that are playing out in front of us. And it's largely for the global audience, which seems clearly a little too obsessed with China, and seems to take the India factor with a bit of complacency. I mean, the awareness level has not hit them yet. And I think that's why, and that's where this second chapter is targeted.
Yeah, you definitely speak to a lot of themes that are more forward looking at that we should start observing even now, because I think it's a problem that we haven't started paying attention to them adequately. And sometimes we overemphasize some problems or features at the cost of the others. Like
this is not. I mean, yes, I agree to that diagnosis, and that's why the book was written. But at the same time, I also think that all the policy making in India is largely done in the wake of crisis. And I told my friend that if one were to write a book on Indian economic policy, it should be called "When Push Comes to Shove." Essentially, when there's a crisis, then only things happen. So it's fine. That's our style. We have pretty much perfected it. It shouldn't be ideally, but we are just too much. Having worked in the government for 5 years, I can, and then being worked in the rural areas, I can assure you that so many issues that we're facing on every day basis, that the government stakeholders cannot keep up. The common citizens are not able to keep up. But I think that the realization is now dawning upon us. So we're just talking about, with the whole women quota thing, we're talking about delimitation, right? And how that might end up penalizing the southern states. It will end up penalizing further the urban constituents. And really, why? Because the southern states are largely urban, where the states which have, where the fertility rate has not gone down, or at least have not been at par with the replacement rate, which are the, UP, Bihar. I come from UP, so, no dig at that. I mean, right? So, but the problem is that they might end up getting more seats, and they're largely rural, right? But the problem is that the India's federal budget and state level budget is largely anyway focused towards rural political economy, and that's the reason that we sort of understate our figures on urbanization, because everyone wants to get the pie of the money, which is for the rural political economy, right? And now this will further slant the budget, and the people who are in the urban constituency, who are generating the growth and doing the innovation and so on, will not be able, given as much representation as their rural counterparts. So again, we're talking about delimitation. Well, here it goes. The urbanization factor plays right into that. So anything and everything you sort of study now is related to urbanization in India. I mean, in some ways it is, and it's just like what America's was from 1850s to 1930, 1940. Of course, after that, but primarily during that period. Or for Europe from 750 to 1900s, right? That's when the urbanization sort of experiment happened. Similarly for China from 1880s to until now, and probably for 2 decades down the road. These changes are happening as fast as we speak, and pretty much all the issues are largely urban issues. Right. I mean, even for the women quota, right? So the point where we started was women quota, and women quota is also largely plays into the whole idea of creating women-friendly cities. I mean, it shouldn't be a separate pursuit. Ideally, all cities should just be friendly to women and all genders, largely. But well, in India's case and a lot of cases of a few other countries, you have to sort of mention it. Rwanda, and now what India is trying to do in terms of creating reservation for women in legislature, that would create a whole sort of a different women-friendly cities. So it's just everything just ties with urbanization and plays right up that alley.
Absolutely. So let's get down to some of the actual details of the challenges that you've discussed. And you've discussed plenty of them, and you've put in a lot of eye-popping numbers about the scale of the challenges. So why don't you take us through some of the infrastructure issues, the utility-related issues in Indian cities?
Right. So when it comes to infrastructure, I want to point out the larger theme about infrastructure one should understand is that there's a social contract, right? Just like we talk about the Thoreau's social contract between the Leviathan state and the common citizens. Similarly, there's a social contract between the citizens of a city and the governor and the city government, right? In terms of, okay, I'll do the innovation, I'll provide the jobs, I'll get better wages, and I'll continue to innovate and so on. That is something that the citizens promise, right? And the governments have to promise in terms of good urban infrastructure so that the congestion forces go down, right? And in that regard, there are a few factors that one should look at, because when we talk about urban infrastructure, we largely talk about either metros or expressways and so on. But I've talked of unsexy infrastructure, so to speak, because that is essentially what we need for our everyday life, whether it's drinking water or whether it's about the quality of groundwater resources and so on and so forth. Right. So there are three sort of infrastructure that I've focused on. First is water and sanitation, where the pursuit essentially is to provide 24/7 piped water supply to households for residential purposes. Similarly, for industrial purposes, we should have continued water supply. There should be limited cross subsidy. And there are certain issues which are the legacy issues of Indian infrastructure sector, which is non-revenue sort of provision of water. There's poor quality, there's leakage, there's poor governance, the resources are depleted, there's certain problem with legislation. So we have to resolve for all those issues. Similarly, then we move on to the sanitation part, within the water sanitation part, which talks about, okay, we've created Swachh Bharat Mission cities and it is largely ODF, but what has happened to that waste, the fecal sludge, right? So in terms of creating that sewerage and sewage network first, second about having those fecal treatment plants, and just having the larger national and state level and city level understanding of what is fecal sludge management and why it is important, and why have in ODF plus are we focusing more on that, but at the ODF stage we were just focusing on the first part of the value chain, right? So that is different part of the infrastructure. The second part I focus is about the solid waste management. So if you look at the water sanitation part, it is much more about resource, pumping resources, like pumping money, pumping people, creating that sort of huge cadre of people who can create resources for 24/7 sort of watts and resources in Indian cities. The second is about solid waste management, which is not very that resource efficient, resource intensive. What you largely need is to have a supply chain figured out for the whole of city. Like Indore has figured out, like Surat has figured out, Ahmedabad has figured out, a few cities in East India have figured out, right? So in terms of solid waste management, you have to figure out the whole value chain, and then you have to get more and more household and industries to sort of comply with it, and then you have a certain success, right? Like, so for instance, people after COVID, they were like, oh, what's going to happen to the biomedical waste, right? When my contention to that was, you do not have to worry about it essentially, because once that you have created that value chain, so if it's any kind of solid waste, you can sort of get rid of it through that, right? So far as you know what are the points from where I'm collecting waste, how I'm transporting them, how I'm treating them, how I'm disposing of them, and I'm sort of recycling and using part of that waste essentially. So it's a part of figuring out the value chain. It's a different kind of problem that you're looking at. And the third is about housing, right? Traditionally, we have largely sort of emphasized of ownership over access, and that's why, I mean, the rental housing market was what, 54% in 1961, and it has reduced to like 31% by 2011 census, right? And that's a problem, because it tells you that, there are a bunch of legislations that we had passed in the in previous decades, which have created a bunch of legacy problems where we continue to focus on ownership rather than access. And it creates a bunch of problem, because you do not have dormitory housing, you do not have hostels for working women, you do not have enough hostels for students. I mean, unlike Europe, right? You have hostels all around. Similarly, what is the role of urban land in that? Because the rental yield in India is incredibly low at 2-3%. 3% would be a great rental yield, but in large cities, the rental yield is 2%, right? So that's a problem, because then it creates it because if you look at this amount of your monthly income, the multiple of monthly income that you have to get rid of to buy a property in India is way more than other cities, and it tells you a lot about how we are using urban land, right, and how we should be using that. So that is that problem, and then you have to create a whole bunch of solutions across the value chain in terms of housing, because depending upon what numbers you're seeing, the shortage is anywhere between 18 million to 50 million, right? And it's a mind-boggling number, because once you go around on outskirts of Delhi, you see thousands of vacant housing. So it's a different kind of housing shortage that we are facing. 99% is from the low-income group and the economically weaker sections, which is largely about congestion, where if you build one or two extra rooms, the problem will be resolved, right? Largely, or they need certain bit of refurbishment and so on. But largely because of the land prices, the affordable housing or the hostel or slash dormitory housing has not been tapped into as much by the private sector, and that needs to be resolved, because then the supply and demand mismatch would sort of get resolved. So there are three different kind of infrastructure categories that I've talked about, but the first principles on all three are very different. But they all three need to be addressed, because technically, if you go into a city, if right now I ask you to, okay, Anirudh, you're moving to DC right now, and but these are the issues that you will talk about. You will not be talking about metros and expressways. Public transport is a different construct, but urban infrastructure largely refers to when you get up and when you go back to bed. What is the immediate infrastructure that you need, essentially? And the problem is that we do not talk about this infrastructure. We either think it's relegated to Nagar Nigam or Jal Nigam, and it's too complicated. It is very engineering focused and so on. It is, but it is also the bunch of policy issues, and that's where the maximum money is also made through corruption also. So that's the whole spiel on urban infrastructure. The challenge is humongous, but the municipal bonds are sort of getting the market discipline in these sectors. Pune, Lucknow, these are the cities who have started experimenting with that. And Swachh Bharat Mission was a great success. There's now fecal sludge treatment plants that are being built. And I think a biggest problem now, Jal Shakti Ministry is sort of looking at the 24/7 piped water supply. We'll have to see how far that goes in terms of replicating it across all Indian towns. And rental housing is something that is a much more difficult complex, because that's also your area of study, right? Urban land, or other land in general, right? And it's a much more complex issue than anything else. So that will take its own sweet time.
Let's stick to that subject while we are at it, the rental land issue. Like you said, it's an area of study for me. So let's talk about that a little bit more. And one of the interesting things that I learned from just talking to people who invest in real estate is that you're right that the yields are around 2 to 3%. But then if you account for taxes, the yield in some cases is actually negative, or it's closer to 0.5 to 1%, which is mind-boggling compared to the relative yield on a property. right? Because if you look at the amount of appreciation that housing or that real estate goes through in all major Indian cities, uh, the yield of 2 to 3% is just unbelievably low. So, in your opinion, what are some of the bottlenecks here? Is it basically all about, like some people talk about, rent control laws? Is it basically a question of laws that are biased in favor of renters, and therefore landlords don't want to rent? Or is there something else going on? Is rental housing just not economically viable due to locational issues or due to tax issues and so on?
Right. No, so I would not go for a simplistic solution, because I tell you, land traditionally has been the asset that has, for, I mean, since advent of agriculture, right, 10,000 BC to until now, it is one asset that has not gone through a major change. Even currency has gone through a major change right now as you speak, right, the crypto and so on. And it is one asset that has not undergone major change. And I think the other asset that has not undergone as much change is higher education. But okay, the nature of it has changed in terms of what you can pursue as higher education, but land largely has not changed, right? And it's a very, very complex topic. And that's why I want to unpack a few things, right? Prasanna Mohanty, I've cited him very liberally. He has done some amazing work on urban land, urban transport, urban economics, and so on. He tells something unique about what is different about urban land. And I want to highlight a few things that, in urban land, every parcel is unique as compared to the rural land, right? Second, while the quantity is finite, the supply is not, because you can go vertical housing, right? Third is that development is not a private right, because it leads to other sort of externalities there. And there's of course an environment definition of it. And the other part is that you can use land for financing, right? And there's a whole horizontal and vertical element of land. And but what we have done is, because the rural political economy weighs on our mind so much, and so does our city planning, urban planning is so slanted towards rural political economy, or at least not slanted by that, but sort of overwhelmed by it, that we have taken a very simplistic view of urban land, where we are afraid to increase FSI, where the rent control acts have been biased against the landlords, where we sort of looked at one point, we looked at ulkra, right, which sort of minimized the amount of land that can be there with you. uh, yeah, the land ceiling, right? And then we also, our public sector enterprises are sitting on thousands and lakhs of hectares of land, and we are not utilizing them. We are not asking them to sort of disclose them. They all need to disclose. If you're not disclosing the amount of land that you have, that is being utilized, that is unutilized, that is underutilized, that is encroached upon, that has been abandoned, then they should be penalized. I think they should all be mandated, from our armed forces to railways, to state and public enterprises, from banks, Air India's, all those enterprises, they should disclose it, right? Third is about that how we look at FSI, that we are just so worried about increasing FSI. We just think of FSI that, oh, if we just increase the FSI, everyone will move in. It's not really the case, right? People will move in if you have the right kind of infrastructure, and you increase FSI in an informed, transit oriented development manner, where you increase it largely around the transport nodes, and you sort of provide infrastructure, and then you go on from there on. Singapore and Hong Kong are great study. I'm not saying that all of India has to be Singapore or Hong Kong, but at least you can look at 10, 15 cities if they're growing in that regard, right? So one is that. The other purpose is about recycling land. We just seem to be get stuck. Okay, here if a residential property is being built for 3 generations or 4 generations, is going to be like that. It is only recently that you start seeing in cities like Lucknow and Kanpur that they've started recycling land. The land use purpose is getting changed now, which is, the turnaround time is sooner. And you can literally utilize that land for, all sorts of purposes. The textile mills of Kanpur are continue to be abandoned, whereas the textile mills of Mumbai are converted into fashion houses, right? And so you maintain the outer sort of facade, which plays into the role of urban design, and where the cities are aesthetically pleasing and the core character of the city remains, but internally you can create a whole bunch of things. Similarly, if you go to this part of Beijing called 798 district, it was a factory to create rifles and bullets and some ammunition for the Communist Party, right? But now it houses fashion houses and cafes and gourmet restaurants, Michelin star restaurants, and so on and so forth, right? So you can be very creative in sort of recycling land. So that sort of unlocks that value. And I think one of the bigger issues that we have at hand on terms of urban land is the number of court cases that ensure that that land is not utilized. It is easier said than done to increase the FSI and recycle land and rent control acts and so on. But the problem is that we have presumptive land titling in India rather than conclusive, and that creates a lot of host of legal issues around it, which delays the whole process of redeveloping the land or redeveloping the asset on that land, and that creates a longer gestation period. The costs go up, and similarly the prices of land go up, and the yields go down around that, and so on and so forth. Right. So vertically also, no, you're not going up. You're afraid to do that. Horizontally, you're stuck in legal issues, and whatever little you have, you are showing little to no creative thinking in terms of how to leverage it. So I think that's largely the summary of I would have put on urban land. But you are the authority. Why don't you speak for a couple of minutes, Anirudh, and then tell me what's your view on what's stopping urban land?
No, I think you're bang on many of these issues. And just as a aside, I did have a chance to visit the 798 district in Beijing about 10 years ago, and it's a wonderful place. I hope we see something similar in one of our cities soon. I think you're right that there is a larger failure of rethinking about how do we do vertical construction in cities, how do we recycle or redevelop areas, for sure. And the question as I read your book was, is this really about a failure of imagination? Because a lot of these things have been tried in so many places, in so many cities, and have been successful in too many geographies to be still discussed and debated, right? So the question is this about not having the right solutions or not having the political will? Or is this about uh, vested interests or political interests who do not want the redevelopment and so on? Is it about homeowners or property owners who don't want either the value of their property to change or the character of the neighborhood to change, right? So is it a problem of policy making, or is it a problem of basically being able to overcome the people who are opposing some of these developments? And this was also it came into my mind when I was reading parts of your book where you were giving interesting examples from around the city. And I was thinking, yes, in some cities like Indore, you've been able to demonstrate a best practice in waste management. So why isn't another city being able to replicate it? What is holding them back? Is it just about the personalities, or is it about uh, a failure to implement an idea due to some other financial constraint or due to political challenges? So these were some of the questions that were coming into my mind.
No, I think this is. I'm sorry to sort of butt in, but this is a very interesting question, right? And on urban land, I largely defer to your understanding that it is a classic case of vested political economy interest because land is at the center of it. It would be very difficult to resolve, but India in the past has shown that the will and way to undertake land reforms. Right. So I think it's not beyond a reach, but at the same time, I think as more and more people sort of get the financialization of India's saving and Indian sort of understanding of savings and investment will reduce the dependence on the land as the primary instrument, and that emotional detachment which sort of uh, help undercut what you said is vested political economy interest. I don't know if it's a correct. There's a fair bit of punditry that I'm doing right now, but it is my assumption that that might play out. The continued financialization of savings would lead to that part, right? So that is my understanding. On terms of why certain cities are able to do it and why they're not, I think the Indian subcontinent is just extremely the political economy of the whole Indian subcontinent, and for the fun of it, if I can say Akhand Bharat, is just overburdened by the cult of personalities. And it has been because largely we've been under empires and kings and monarchs and so on for the longest period of time. And now also, if you see, and I'm not referring to the national government and so on, I'm largely referring to the state governments which have deprived cities of the functions being devolved, and they're being empowered under the 74th Amendment and the 12th Schedule and so on and so forth, right? So you're still dependent on the chief minister and a rock star sort of a bureaucrat that would come to your development authority or your smart city project who will be heading it, and depending upon the charisma and the will of that particular person, the things will change in that. So that's why, and citizens are, their hands are tied. They don't know whom to reach out. There is no mayor. There is no direct sort of influence. To the principle of subsidiarity sort of it gets defeated in Indian cities, right? You don't know whom to reach out and who will provide the services. You just get bogged down by the details and the forms and running around, right? And and that is why some cities succeed, some do not, because we are currently dependent not on the larger upliftment of the discourse of the common population, or having a municipal cadre, or sort of empowered and trained and weather beaten urban local bodies across India. We are dependent upon the cults of personalities of certain bureaucrats in either smart cities or development authorities, or at the state bureaucracy level, or in certain departments or state chief ministers, essentially, and or maybe some member of parliaments. So that's why there's a heavy dependence on certain kind of things, right? There's certain legacy factors that, of course, play into that in terms of what kind of industries are there, what kind of educational institutes have been there. Indore has been at the, it has been at the center of a certain empire for several centuries now, and it has done well. It has been in the center of attention of those of that particular empire for several centuries, and it has certain kind of educational institutes that provide a certain kind of good breeding ground for an active citizenship. But so does Bangalore. But why is Bangalore infrastructure so poor, right? And but so does a lot of other cities. I mean, Lucknow is not deprived of such cities, of such, or rather such institutes. But why is solid waste management not up to mark in Lucknow? So again, I would defer to the issue of the cult of personalities, essentially, and that's why we need much more urban devolution and sort of empowerment under the 74th Amendment. I hope sort of it answers. There's a fair bit of punditry, I know, but I hope it answers your questions.
Yeah, in some sense, you're basically saying that we are currently dependent on individuals because there is some kind of a institutional or structural problem in how we govern our cities in at least two ways. One is that if these rockstar individuals, as you refer to them, if they're not there, there is a lot of inertia in terms of ideas and the will to do things differently or to try out new things. And the other is that by default, the governance institutions themselves are not really geared to experiment or to try new things or to cope with the changes that are occurring in their cities.
Yeah, yeah. That would be a good summary of what I was trying to say. Indeed.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, you do place the eventual blame of a lot of these problems on the way our governance works towards the end of the book. So, talk to me a little bit about that.
I would not say it's an eventual blame. I would say the ultimate blame, the only blame, lies in urban governance. And it was a cross-cutting theme, and at some point, urban governance was a cross-cutting theme, just like sustainability and the gender angle and the economic growth angle and urban design angle in the book. I kept referring to it again and again. I realized that I can't do this. It has to be a separate section where I need to unpack those things, because these things are very, very, very problematic, right? In 74th Amendment, Metropolitan Planning Committee was sort of envisaged for, right? And Ishwar Ahluwalia was the biggest critique of this, that, wherever it existed on paper. There was nothing that happening on and sort of metropolitan governance. We are not looking at, NCR from Greater Noida up to Faridabad and to other districts on the other sides, up to Meerut, in fact, now. That, how we are sort of looking at just thinking about it as largely a labor market and sort of resolving for issues. We're just too fraught into who's doing what and who will get the power for what. And it's unfortunate that we're still having that dialogue. The second is the whole question of mayors, right? We do not have mayors. We got Sardar Patel, we got Nehru, we got Bose, because they were mayors. It also is a good breeding ground for national leaders, where they test their frame in terms of their appetite to govern, and if they have that sort of will and appetite to govern properly. Not only that, but also there's no. So a mayor is who would be the executive head of a city, right? Just like chief ministers for states and prime minister for the country, and you do not have that. So who do you go and blame that this is not happening, this is not functioning right, and so on? Even if where the mayors exist, they do not have real powers. The richer the city, the weaker the mayor is, the lower their tenure is. They're largely, it's just like nominal head they exist. They're neither coterminous with the councillors. They do not have any executive power. They do not have any say over the parastatal agencies. This is just problematic, right? The whole mayor thing. And it's something that needs to be properly addressed. And I mean, even China sort of achieved a lot of success on urbanization and monetizing urban land because their mayors are really empowered. And so is in the US, so is in the Europe. So this is something that we have to do at some point or the other time, but it has to happen, like the mayor thing. The second is about the 74th Amendment, which talks about the 12th schedule and the 18 functions under it that will be devolved to the city government. Of course, there's no city government. The devolution has been only to like a couple of functions, studies done by Janagrah and Praja Foundation, I guess. They have done the survey, both of them, and they're finding that like only few functions have been devolved across different cities. And again, the richer the city, the less is the devolution, because of course the vested interest will get much more sort of money out of not devolving. And then even in those 18 schedules, then there are a bunch of things which are very outdated in terms of how would you take care of your cattle and so on, and the tanneries, which were a thing that you would envisage in 93, 94 when this was passed, this legislation. But now the urban governance has changed. It has to be a lot about urban health. It's about have to be pedestrianizing. It's about air pollution. It's about dust control, and a bunch of other issues. But I'm so alarmed by a lot of national policymakers and certain state policymakers who in private told me that maybe India will never have that 74th Amendment fulfilled because there's sort of political economy interest involved, and that sort of really alarmed me, because if we do not do that, urbanization will continue to remain a binding constraint. We need to devolve. That is, I mean, that cannot happen any other way. Now, when that happens, my contest to that is, it's just not only we have to devolve those 18 functions. I argue in the book that we should go from 18 to 14 functions. Because at 18 level, you only devolve 4 or 5 functions. If we ask for 40, then probably they will give us 20, 25 functions being devolved. And I tell you, the next hero or the heroine or the rock star of Indian policymaking will not be the next prime minister or the current prime minister or whosoever. It will be the chief minister who would bite the bullet and undertake the 74th Amendment in their state. She or he will not get re-elected, I can assure you, because a lot of people will not earn as much money as they can right now, right, without devolution. But that person will create a movement, a tsunami, which will be sort of asked by other states, like the people in other states, and it will not stop at anything. That's the thing about Indian policy making. If you go on a certain path, there's a certain kind of path dependency that you cannot come back from. But who will be the first one to bite the bullet is something to be seen. There are some certain promising sort of starts here and there, but they're very few. So that's that. And largely, so I will stick to like 3 problem areas. I've told you about the mayor thing. I've told you about the 74th Amendment. The bunch of other issues about property taxes, municipal cadre, and so on and so forth. I will not go there. The other issue that I will pick is how we define what is urban. India has one of the most stringent definition of what is defined as urban, right? The census uses a mix of 3 criteria to say that, this 2011 data census that, we're 31% urban. Whereas statutory towns, they say, as per these statutory towns are the towns which are defined by states that they are urban. And because, again, of the whole money that goes to the rural political economy, they want to be defined as largely as rural. So statutory towns, they have, that's the urbanization by 2011 was like 25%, right? So that 26%. So that 5% gap in 2011, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, was close to 12 Singapore, 60 million people, right? As for 1.2 billion people, right, back then. And now that's a problem that, as much of that area is like ungoverned or rather misgoverned, first of all. Second, if you are misclassifying areas from urban to rural, you are not giving that kind of infrastructure to those areas. And again, the innovation and so on, and the width of the road, the kind of infrastructure that should be there, right? That is not there. Rural areas also do not want to be identified as urban areas because then they will lose money from the schemes, but they will also have to pay property taxes. So that's another problem that we are facing there. Another issue that we face in terms of this is that largely countries use 1 or 2 indicators to sort of define what is urban. India uses for the census 3 criteria, and the states use a mix of 6 or 8 criteria in different ways, right? So I think it makes sense that when the next census, I shouldn't say if, but when the next census is done, They can continue to have a similar definition of the three criteria, but they should also create two or three parallel definitions, that if you just take this criteria, we are this much urban. If you just take this criteria, with this much urban, that would impress upon people and the constituents and the legislature and the bureaucracy that, oh, we are this much urban, we need to work towards that. We are sort of, because of some whatever reasons, but we need to have that definition which we used in previous decades to sort of have a certain continuity, and we can see what's the break, right? And have a parallel exercise done by census and say, okay, boss, if we do this, then we are this much urban, right? So IDFC, which is now Artha Global, has done a lot of research on that. And if they use the criteria used by Ghana and Qatar, we are 47% urban as per the 2011 census. And if you use the criteria used by Mexico and Venezuela, which is a threshold of 2,500 people, we would be 65% urban. Again, that was 12 years ago. So imagine how much urban we already are. And if we are, then we are not providing the right infrastructure. No, we are not raising the revenues like that. We are not using the land vertically like that as we should be. We're not getting the right kind of governance. We're not giving the right kind of jobs. People are not following the right kind of sort of rules. And that's why the whole quality of life, wage, innovation, economic growth all comes crashing down. So again, urban governance is the thing, right? And I can go into my many more issues on urban governance, but I'll stick to these three because I don't want to be certain sort of attention being spread out across too many issues. But these three are key. Okay, of course, if you want to talk about property tax, we can talk about that, or lack of municipal cadre and how understaffed they are, and the whole role of data in tech and city governance will play a role. So these are some of the other issues in that.
Yeah, you're bang on, and I couldn't agree more. I think the issue or the point that you raised about this uh, governance of small cities and planning in small cities is especially important because, yes, our large cities are sometimes the size of small states or even small countries, and they are complicated. There are multifaceted issues. But at least for the smaller cities, there is a real problem that if you don't lay down the infrastructure right now, and if you don't have at least a very high level of planning implemented in them, once those cities grow and develop, you can't undo that. And it's going to be prohibitively both financially and politically expensive to start planning once those cities are already developed and grown. And that means you really need to get ahead of the game and think about how you're going to take care of urbanization for small cities differently compared to the kinds of urban challenges in the large cities.
I will also say that, of course, I said that the next star of policymaking will be the chief minister who does the devolution, but and also sort of has an in-place mayoral system that it does, or a certain kind of, national leader who really goes for the kill, like the juggler, that no, we will do this, we will have the model act, and wherever our governments exist, we will adopt it, right? That will be a tsunami of reforms, right? And it will change face of India like nothing else. So that's that. But at the same time, I think because a lot of your listeners are players from the private sector. And I think private sector in India is fast gaining currency in terms of providing a feedback loop on the reforms. It started with somewhere in 80s, and now we're sort of at some form of crescendo where the feedback loop from the private sector really plays a role in policy making. Someone who's worked in Niti Aayog, and I've relied on their inputs a lot of times. And I urge the private sector, perhaps through your channel, is that, the ease of doing business will primarily come from devolution. They don't need to go to single window clearance to the national government or to the state government. That's just plain stupid. They should not be. The real ease of doing business would be that if you go to a municipality, this is the mayor. That mayor needs to win the next election. She or he will fight tooth and nail to get investments, to get jobs into their city. They will go all over the world to invite investments, to monetize their urban land, to create proper urban infrastructure, and they will work very closely with the private sector and say, okay, boss, you're a market investor, you're coming to this. Okay, what do you need? Oh, you are you're Apple, you are Meta, you're trying to create a data center here, right? What all do you need from me? And this is okay, you get it from one sign off from the mayor, you get it. That's the real ease of doing business. You do not need to go to state bunch of offices or at the national level. So private sector needs to. I would urge through your channel that private sector should increase the tempo on asking for devolution and for expansion of the 12th schedule. From 18 function, 18 function is just way too less. And if you look at urban health and like how urban planning should be, how we should look at child-friendly cities, air pollution, the law and order. I mean, the water sanitation, the infrastructure issues. I think it should be close to 25, 30 functions, 40 functions.
No, there's a lot of food for thought in what you're saying. Uh, I think we need to wrap up soon, but I'll ask you one question based on a topic that you covered in this book that is usually not covered in books on cities and urbanization, which is about how you actually bring up children in a city. And I want to ask you, A, why did you think of this as something that you wanted to include in the book? Because it's a very interesting part of the book. And also, what are the main issues that you wanted to bring up?
Right. About the child friendly cities, right? Yeah, I mean, because we keep talking about demographic dividend and so on, and when you have 120 million children in urban areas, which is as per the government figures, of course, you have much more, probably close to 220 to 40 million children in urban areas. And you're not talking about it. You're talking about gender friendly, women friendly cities. It's a blind spot. And again, so someone asked me, someone very very senior, Devashish, what's your thesis of the book? I said the title of the book is the thesis in India's blind spot. Like it's I cannot be more clear. So that's why I would say that it's a commentary on the Indian political economy because we are ignoring our children right now. We're just focusing on how to increase workforce participation rate and so on. If we don't focus on our children as much, we are focused on the terms of like there are two very marquee policies in terms of right to education and the midday meal that has really changed the game on what we do for our children. But we need to go a step further. I do that because a colleague of mine works in this space, and we were having a conversation, and I was like, I want to talk about it from the lens of urbanization, and clearly all these issues. If you look at all the sections in the book, there actually can be very different books altogether, right? But I have brought them all together to study what is Indian political economy right now, how it will play out for the coming decades through the lens of cities, and that's why I picked up children also in that regard. Now, when it comes to children, it's tricky because children do not have agency. If women do not have agency, you can still know because they will be able to vocalize it in some way or the other. But children, how will they vocalize that they do not have agency? So you have to anticipate the agency, and they might not look at agency in the manner that a grown up might look like, right? And that's why it is very difficult to envisage. But I've just tried to put in myself into the shoes of children and just imagine, what is going wrong here and there and a bunch of other things. So one was, of course, the learning outcome thing, right? Because the whole privatization of the housing and the whole neighborhood culture going away and so on and so forth. And then you were just staying in the school, you take the bus because the traffic is too much. Your parents are afraid that you might have a injury there. You just run to your home and just play within that space. So the whole sort of one is the learning outcome education part of it. The second is socialization. The third is about reducing the public distrust, right? If you grow up in just so many private spaces, from housing to school to malls and to the sports complex, and you're not socializing in public space, then there's a huge distrust quotient that we're building across India. So right, that will have to be addressed, right? Then there is a whole element of crimes, especially violent crimes against children. So that is something that needs to be addressed. And then of course, traffic congestion is a problem because we do not have sidewalks, and then the people hardly follow the zebra crossing thing. And there are a bunch of issues when it comes to congestion and risk and injury when it comes to road transport there. And the unequal access to cities, which I again talked about, because they cannot drive around, someone will take them, the public spaces are reducing, where will they go, where will they play, and so on and so forth, right? Their idea of life and maximizing life experiences is very different from a grown up, and so is their agency. Right. And the examples are very interesting. So there's a foundation called Bernard Van Leer Foundation, which has this initiative called Urban 95, because 95 centimeters, they imagine the height of a child. And then they will try and look the city through the lens of the child. And then they will sort of go about planning for it and so on and so forth. There are a bunch of states and cities in India that have started experimenting with policemen who are trained in handling children, right? Whether it's when a traumatic incident has happened in their family outside, or they're involved in that, then they should be able to speak to them, right? You create child-friendly cities through that you do not create trauma over trauma, right? Then there's a whole idea of creating more public spaces and parks, which is just not a bland idea, but you try and create it where you map those facilities where more and more children can access it. But suppose if there's urban flooding, you can sort of use that facility to store more water and then children will of course not go there, but you will use that as a reservoir. I think I've mentioned an example I'm forgetting the city, but that has actually used that. I think it's Rotterdam that has used that, right? Then there's some cities which have done a little bit of extreme work in terms of creating a separate infrastructure for children, which I think is also a little extreme because they need to be socialized with other sort of communities of cities as well. They do not, and that would also be not very environment friendly. Then there's a whole concept of participatory planning. So cities like Dhaka and Boston, they have started doing participatory planning where they ask inputs from children of different communities and sort of get to know, because there's a lot of children who are in urban slums. 1/3 of those children are stunted, right? A fraction of them are fully immunized, right? And there's a bunch of issues. A large share of them are malnourished. They're exposed to all sort of risks and traumas, right? So you have to plan for a city that goes that far. And it's like if you have the goalpost that high and that far, the pursuit will never end. And that's a great pursuit to have, that your pursuit will never end. And second is that in catching up to that, you will create a lot of positive externalities. So, a lot of people, when they read the book, they were like, oh, child-friendly cities is just too idealistic. How will you do this, that, and so on and so forth? I was like, well, if you're not trying for it, if you're not having that conversation, we'll definitely not go that far. So that is the whole idea of to sort of plug this conversation. And I wrote this paper for one of the think tanks back during COVID, and then I sort of used part of it as a section in the book. And I still continue to get compliments on this chapter because there are a lot of concerned parents who might have Googled about it and they came across this paper, and then they've reached out to me, oh, thank you for talking about it, because we're not talking about it. And it becomes their vulnerable section. They do not have agency and they have a different kind of issues than particularly male have who are largely the planners. So we have to look at both from the gender perspective and also from the age perspective. Similarly, it's for old people also. But that's a different kind of conversation. Yeah.
And as you also point out in the book, urbanization is such a recent phenomenon, relative to human history, that some of these issues, like you say, are genuine blind spots. It's something we have not really paid enough attention to. But Devashish, thank you. We've covered a lot of ground in the last 1 hour. It's been a really good discussion. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Anirudh, and the Carnegie team for sort of having me on this podcast. And again, I actually mean it that you and there are a few other podcasts that have created a body of work which has become a go-to podcast for political economy and policy enthusiasts. So thank you so much. I feel extremely privileged and honored to having a conversation with you about my book at for a Carnegie podcast. So thank you so much again. And I hope this incites further conversation. And I hope that I'm leaving you and your listeners with much more questions than answers. And that is the whole pursuit of the book. And to flip how they see India, Indian political economy and Indian cities and how to go about it.
I'm sure it will do that, Devashish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anirudh.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time.